The NDP government tabled their interim budget update on Monday. It's the first NDP budget in more than a decade and a half, and in it, the new government makes good on a number of its campaign promises. We're going to dive into a discussion about the updated budget with Jock Finlayson, Chief Policy Officer at the Business Council of British Columbia. Thanks for joining us, Jock.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Hey, listen, a lot of people think that NDP governments mean that the sky will fall economically. Did the sky fall Monday?
Well, no, I mean, BC's got quite a bit of economic momentum, and certainly this budget update isn't going to derail that in and of itself by any means. And in fact, the government is benefiting from fairly robust, revenue growth and strong job market, and consumer spending has been very robust in BC. So they're really benefiting from a very strong economy that they inherited, and it remains to be seen whether their policies over the next, 6, 12, 18 months will slow the economy or improve it, or maybe have no impact at all. It's too early to tell at this stage.
A lot of spending has been promised, and the government does have a fairly sizable surplus to play with, and we do await a full budget come early next year. Does it make sense to see this much spending now because BC is in such an economically strong position?
Yeah, I think there, some caution's in order because our economy has been growing at an unsustainable pace. It's growing faster than potential. We're certainly going to see a slowing down, as the budget itself actually forecasts, as we move into 2018 and particularly after that. And I do have a bit of concern that the government is going to be hardwiring a lot of new spending commitments into their sort of budgetary plan. Things like firefighting costs are one-offs that occur in a given year, but bringing new programs forward and then funding them on a permanent basis or higher social assistance payments and things like that, you have to pay for those on an ongoing fiscal basis. So this budget itself, doesn't blow the lights out by any means, but we will be looking to see what they come up with in February and later in terms of spending increases and whether we feel they're affordable. So at this point, it's more of a kind of a yellow light rather than a red light.
Jock, you used the term hardwired, and yet as a wired world, we expect that governments have a very concerted technology strategy. I didn't get a lot out of today's economic update that suggested that the NDP are in that 21st century.
Yeah, I think, they talk about creating an innovation commission or an innovation commissioner. And, that's something we support. We hope to engage with that. But we didn't really see any specific announcements today of measures that would be beneficial to growing the technology economy or building innovation across the whole BC economy. So that's really work to come, I think, Kirk.
Yeah.
And that's an area we're going to be anxious to engage with them on in the coming months for sure.
Yeah, I mean, they talked about an emerging economy task force, which just doesn't sound like much gets done over the next year.
Yeah, I mean, I think, a certain amount of cynicism is probably warranted on that front. On the other hand, I do think our economy is changing. As somebody who spends his time trying to analyze what's going on, I certainly have that view myself. And, the lines between industries are getting blurry. The rise of the digital economy and all these digital platforms really is changing the way business is done. It's changing the labor market. And I think trying to get a handle on how the economy is shifting, particularly the sort of technology-driven changes, is a useful exercise, in terms of the analytics and maybe getting some better data so we know what's going on. So at least that aspect of it, I can see some value of a new economy task force. It really depends on who will be sitting on it and what the specific mandate is as to whether it's meaningful or just window dressing. And again, at this point, I wouldn't pass judgment on that, but we'll certainly keep an eye on it.
Jock, as you know, there have been rumblings about how an NDP government could be bad for business investment, particularly in certain sectors, resources, to name one. What do you think the government now is signaling with their tabled budget, particularly given that it is honoring a 0.5 percentage point cut to the small business tax rate? It's also increasing the corporate tax rate by a percentage point.
Yeah, I don't think that combination is terribly helpful because we already have incredibly low small business tax rates in BC and Canada. And, a 0.5 point cut I would say, is more sort of symbolic than real. What we need to do is encourage companies to grow. We need more mid-sized and larger firms in our market that are paying people high wages and building a high productivity economy. There wasn't very much in the budget that's going to, point in that direction. And I think, I apologize for that. I think we do have a concern about the overall competitive landscape in the province, particularly for resource industries and manufacturing and transportation. And we'll be working to try and persuade the government that we need some more action in terms of tax reform, regulatory changes that will create a more competitive environment in BC. We definitely have been losing ground on that front. It just didn't start with the election of the NDP. It's been happening over the medium term, and we need a response to try and address that. So that's still work to be done, I would say.
How should we read the government's signal today that the carbon tax will no longer be a revenue neutral tax in this province? What do you think that means?
Well, I think they want to spend the money. The carbon tax is going to become a significant revenue source as it goes up from $30 a ton to $50 and beyond. And it's going to be generating, $1.5 billion or more a year. And the government wants to use that to spend on a variety of different initiatives rather than essentially recycling it back into the economy through tax cuts. So we're not surprised by that. That was clear from their platform. I am concerned that moving up, sharply with higher carbon taxes in BC, when other jurisdictions are moving more slowly, or in many cases not at all, is really going to undercut our competitive position in the natural resource industries and some of the energy-intensive manufacturing sectors. So we're not particularly enthusiastic about that, and we'll be urging the government to look at some measures they can take to offset some of the impact of escalating energy costs on some of the vulnerable industries in BC. At the moment, we haven't seen any specific measures that would do that. So that's a priority for my organization over the next 6 months.
We're speaking with Jock Finlayson. He is the Chief Policy Officer at the Business Council of British Columbia. We're talking about the NDP's interim budget tabled on Monday. One thing that jumped out to me, Jock, was projected declining revenues from mining-related activities. It's an industry that's recovering a little bit, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on what you think the new government's relationship is going to be like with this industry based on what we've heard either in the throne speech or the budget or previous comments.
Yeah, I think there'll be some rocky road ahead. The mining sector is going to be very much disadvantaged by a rising carbon tax with no offsets. So I think they're going to be quite concerned about that. There's also a worry in some parts of the natural resource sector, including mining, about potential new legislation on environmental assessment and species at risk in BC, which were not matters discussed in the budget today. But we do know from the NDP platform that those are commitments that they're likely to act on over the course of the next couple of years. So the whole question of the regulatory environment for resource exploration and resource extraction, I think, is something that's going to be a priority, certainly for the mining industry. On the other hand, the government has kept a lot of the senior public servants in place who are knowledgeable about the resource economy. Doug Donaldson, who's the Minister of Forest, Lands, and Natural Resource Operations, is well known in a lot of the resource industries. And I think he's quite well respected. So we'll hold judgment on it. But mining, I think, is an area that we'll be keeping an eye on as to how attractive BC remains for new investment in that sector.
Did you think, Jock, that the projections were prudent sufficiently? They articulated not just commodity price volatility, but Brexit and China and Trump and NAFTA and the Bank of Canada. They seemed to load on all these possible headwinds. Were they good enough projections?
They're very conservative in their economic and revenue forecasting. I would say they're below the private sector's consensus for growth in the BC economy in 2018 and 19. So I think on the economic and commodity price projections, there's an abundance of caution built into the budget, which will give them some cushion to work with if economic conditions actually soften. So on that, more or less the status quo from the previous government sort of used the same approach of, I would describe as very cautious kind of economic forecasting.
That's Jock Finlayson, Chief Policy Officer at the Business Council of British Columbia.
Well, I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jock.